You are sleeping enough. You know you are sleeping enough because you are in bed for 7, sometimes 8 hours, and you are not staying up late or waking through the night the way you used to when the kids were young and the job was demanding. The sleep is there, but the rest is not. You wake up and the exhaustion is still present, sitting somewhere behind the eyes and in the bones, a heaviness that coffee temporarily edges away, but never actually lifts. By early afternoon it is back. By evening you are counting down to bed, not because the day was full, but because your body is already finished with it. You have mentioned this to a doctor at some point, maybe more than once, and the answer you received was probably a version of the same thing. You are getting older, this is normal, make sure you are sleeping well, try to reduce stress, and you went home with nothing changed, because the thing driving the fatigue was never identified, never named, and never treated. Because the thing driving the fatigue is not what any of those answers were addressing. There is a specific, documented biological cause of persistent fatigue in people over 60 that is dramatically underdiagnosed in the primary care setting. It is not depression, though chronic fatigue can eventually feed depression. It is not simply aging, though aging is a contributing context. It is not sleep apnea, though sleep apnea should always be ruled out. It is a dysfunction in the cellular energy production system itself, a failure occurring at the level of the mitochondria, the microscopic structures inside every cell in the body that convert oxygen and nutrients into the energy currency that powers every biological process from muscle contraction to cognitive function. When mitochondrial function declines, the symptom is not pain. It is not dysfunction in a way that shows up dramatically on standard blood panels. The primary symptom is fatigue, a profound, persistent cellular-level exhaustion that feels unlike ordinary tiredness because it is unlike ordinary tiredness. It is the feeling of a body running on insufficient power, every system working harder than it should to achieve what once required no effort, because the energy supply has been compromised at its source. This is Dr. Victor Lang, and understanding this mechanism is exactly the kind of conversation this channel was built for. Because the gap between what is known about mitochondrial decline and fatigue in aging adults and what is routinely communicated in the clinical setting is one of the most consequential information gaps in senior health. If this is where you want to get real answers, hit like and subscribe right now, because what follows is going to reframe what you thought you understood about why you are tired. Let us start at the cellular level, because the story makes no sense without the foundation. Every cell in your body that produces energy for biological function, and that is virtually every cell in your body, does so through a process called oxidative phosphorylation, which occurs inside the mitochondria. Mitochondria take the glucose and fatty acids that your digestion has broken food into, combine them with oxygen from your bloodstream, and through an elegant series of biochemical steps generate a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, commonly known as ATP. ATP is the universal energy currency of the cell. Every muscle contraction, every nerve impulse, every heartbeat, every thought, every immune response, every repair process requires ATP, and the mitochondria are the factory producing it. A young, healthy cell in an active tissue like the heart or skeletal muscle may contain hundreds to thousands of mitochondria, and those mitochondria may be operating at high efficiency, producing enormous quantities of ATP per unit of oxygen consumed. But here is what happens as that cell ages, particularly after 60. The mitochondria themselves accumulate damage. Their own DNA, which is separate from the nuclear DNA in the cell's nucleus and more vulnerable to oxidative damage, develops mutations over time. The membranes of the mitochondria, which are essential for the electrochemical gradient that drives ATP production, become less efficient. The complex protein machinery of the electron transport chain, the series of molecules that actually transfer energy in the ATP production process, degrades. The result is not a sudden collapse. It is a gradual, cumulative reduction in the ATP output per mitochondrion, combined in many cases with a reduction in the total number of functional mitochondria per cell, as damaged ones are eliminated and not fully replaced. Less ATP per cell, per tissue, per organ. The body still functions, but it functions the way a building functions on reduced power. Everything still runs, but nothing runs quite the way it should. And the experience of this reduced biological power is what most people call fatigue, and most doctors call aging. What makes this so important to understand is that mitochondrial decline is not a uniform, unstoppable process. It is accelerated by specific conditions that are common, addressable, and in many cases, completely modifiable. Chronic inflammation, which becomes more prevalent with age, partly due to accumulated oxidative damage and partly due to changes in immune regulation, directly damages mitochondrial membranes and suppresses the mitochondrial biogenesis process through which new mitochondria are created. Insulin resistance, which is present to some degree in a very large proportion of adults over 55, impairs the delivery of glucose into cells and interferes with the signaling pathways that regulate mitochondrial function and production. Specific nutritional deficiencies, particularly in the micronutrients that serve as cofactors in the electron transport chain and in mitochondrial membrane maintenance, directly reduce ATP production efficiency in ways that are measurable and in many cases reversible. And chronic psychological and physiological stress, through its effects on cortisol and its downstream consequences for cellular oxidative balance, accelerates mitochondrial aging in ways that compound the other factors. The nutritional deficiency piece of this story deserves the most detailed attention because it is the most actionable and the most commonly missed in standard clinical evaluation. The primary mitochondrial cofactors, whose deficiency is most strongly associated with the kind of persistent fatigue we are describing in older adults, are coenzyme Q10, magnesium, iron, B vitamins, particularly B1 thiamine and B2 riboflavin and B3 niacin and B12, and carnitine. Each of these plays a specific and non-substitutable role in mitochondrial energy production, and each becomes more likely to be deficient in older adults for reasons that are partly about absorption, partly about dietary patterns, and partly about the increased demand that aging cells place on these systems. Coenzyme Q10, often abbreviated CoQ10, is perhaps the most clinically significant of these for the fatigue picture because its role in mitochondrial function is absolutely central, and its decline with age is dramatic and well documented. CoQ10 sits at the junction between two of the major complexes in the mitochondrial electron transport chain, acting as the essential carrier molecule that transfers electrons between them. Without adequate CoQ10, the electron transport chain cannot run efficiently. Proton gradients that drive ATP synthesis become compromised. Energy production per mitochondrion drops. And the tissue that contains the most mitochondria, and therefore has the highest CoQ10 requirement, is the one you might not guess. It is the heart muscle, followed by skeletal muscle, and then the liver. The profound fatigue that people with CoQ10 deficiency experience reflects the energy failure occurring in exactly the tissues that demand the most ATP. Research has documented that plasma CoQ10 levels fall by approximately 65% between the ages of 20 and 80 in healthy adults with no identified disease. This is not a pathological deficiency requiring a diagnosis. It is a standard feature of the aging biochemistry that almost no one's doctor is routinely measuring or addressing. And it is a feature that is almost entirely reversible with supplementation because CoQ10 supplementation reliably raises plasma and tissue CoQ10 levels and has been shown in controlled trials to reduce fatigue, improve exercise tolerance, and improve cardiac function in older adults with documented deficiency. Magnesium's role in this story sits alongside CoQ10 in importance and is even more pervasive in the population. Magnesium is required as a cofactor for over 300 enzymatic reactions in the human body, and among the most critical of those reactions are the ones involved in ATP production and utilization. ATP, the energy molecule itself, is only biologically active when it is bound to magnesium. MgATP is the actual functional form of cellular energy. When magnesium is deficient, even if ATP is produced, its biological activity is compromised. The research consistently shows that 60 to 80% of American adults consume less than the recommended daily intake of magnesium. And older adults have additional reasons for deficiency, including reduced intestinal absorption, increased renal excretion, and higher rates of medication use that interferes with magnesium status. The symptoms of magnesium deficiency are almost identical to the symptoms of mitochondrial dysfunction: persistent fatigue, muscle weakness, cognitive fog, poor sleep quality, and a general sense of systemic underperformance that is real, measurable, and frequently dismissed as aging. The carnitine piece of this story is one that most people have never encountered in the context of senior fatigue, and it is worth taking a moment to explain because the mechanism is both elegant and directly actionable. Carnitine, produced in the body from the amino acids lysine and methionine, is the molecule responsible for transporting long-chain fatty acids across the mitochondrial membrane so that they can be burned for energy in the ATP production process. Without carnitine, the fats that should be providing a major portion of cellular energy cannot enter the mitochondria. The cell is forced to rely more heavily on glucose, and when glucose availability varies, cellular energy production becomes less stable and less efficient. Older adults produce less carnitine endogenously, partly due to reduced synthesis capacity, and partly due to changes in the renal reabsorption of carnitine that reduces its retention. Research on acetyl L-carnitine supplementation in older adults with documented fatigue has shown consistent improvements in energy, cognitive function, and physical performance that are attributed to the restoration of mitochondrial fatty acid transport and the additional role of the acetyl group in supporting acetylcholine synthesis in the brain. The inflammation connection to mitochondrial fatigue deserves direct attention because it creates a vicious cycle that is important to understand. Chronic low-grade inflammation, the systemic inflammatory state that becomes more prevalent with age, and that is driven by oxidative stress, gut dysbiosis, insulin resistance, and other factors, produces inflammatory cytokines that directly inhibit mitochondrial function. Specifically, tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6, two of the primary inflammatory signaling molecules elevated in chronic low-grade inflammation, suppress the expression of genes involved in mitochondrial biogenesis and impair the function of complex 1 in the electron transport chain. This means that addressing fatigue from the mitochondrial angle is not just about supplementing CoQ10 and magnesium. It requires simultaneously addressing the inflammatory burden that is suppressing the mitochondria's ability to function. Anti-inflammatory dietary patterns that reduce processed food intake, increase omega-3 fatty acids, include polyphenol-rich plants, and support gut microbiome diversity are not separate from the mitochondrial fatigue story. They are integral to it, because the inflammation they suppress is one of the primary drivers of the mitochondrial dysfunction they are ultimately addressing. Exercise, and specifically the type of exercise that is most accessible to older adults, plays a direct and powerful role in mitochondrial health that deserves to be stated clearly. Mitochondrial biogenesis, the process of creating new mitochondria within cells, is stimulated most powerfully by a signaling molecule called PGC1-alpha, which is activated most effectively by physical activity. Even moderate intensity exercise, walking briskly, cycling at a comfortable pace, swimming, produces enough PGC1-alpha activation to stimulate the creation of new mitochondria in skeletal muscle. Research consistently shows that previously sedentary older adults who begin a moderate exercise program show measurable increases in mitochondrial content and function in skeletal muscle within 8 to 12 weeks. The fatigue that was self-perpetuating through inactivity, where tiredness prevented movement and the absence of movement deepened the mitochondrial decline that drove the tiredness, can be interrupted with as little as 20 to 30 minutes of moderate movement 3 to 5 times per week. This is not the most dramatic intervention, but its biological effect on the mitochondrial population in the muscles that move you through your life is one of the most well-documented and most consistent findings in the research on aging and energy metabolism. There is one more piece of this story that lands differently than the rest, and I want to name it carefully because it involves a class of medications that millions of older adults take every day. Statins, the cholesterol-lowering drugs that are among the most commonly prescribed medications in adults over 50, inhibit an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase that is part of the cholesterol synthesis pathway. This is their intended mechanism. But this same pathway is also responsible for the synthesis of CoQ10, because CoQ10 is produced through the same biochemical route that produces cholesterol in the liver. Statin therapy consistently reduces plasma CoQ10 levels, sometimes significantly, and the muscle pain and profound fatigue that are among the most commonly reported side effects of statin therapy are now understood by many researchers to be at least partly mediated by this CoQ10 depletion and its consequences for mitochondrial function in muscle tissue. This is documented well enough that in some European countries, CoQ10 supplementation is routinely recommended alongside statin prescriptions. In the United States, this recommendation is far from universal. The result is that a meaningful number of older adults taking statins are experiencing fatigue and muscle symptoms that their physician attributes to aging or to other causes, when the mechanism is the medication-induced CoQ10 depletion that is directly suppressible with supplementation. If you are on a statin and you are experiencing persistent fatigue, this connection deserves to be discussed with your physician with the specific framing of CoQ10 status and its relationship to your medication. The practical framework for addressing mitochondrial origin fatigue in older adults integrates several elements that work synergistically. CoQ10 in the ubiquinol form, which is the reduced, more bioavailable form that aging bodies convert to more readily than the ubiquinone form, at doses between 100 and 300 milligrams daily, depending on the individual context. Magnesium in a bioavailable form, such as magnesium glycinate or magnesium malate, which are better tolerated and better absorbed than magnesium oxide at doses that bring daily intake into the recommended range for the individual. Acetyl L-carnitine at 500 to 1,000 milligrams daily for the fatty acid transport and cognitive support benefits. A comprehensive B vitamin complex that addresses the full spectrum of mitochondrial B vitamin cofactors rather than isolated high-dose supplementation of one. An anti-inflammatory dietary pattern that reduces the inflammatory cytokine burden suppressing mitochondrial function. And a consistent, gentle exercise practice that stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis through PGC1 alpha activation. None of these alone is a complete solution. Together, they address the multiple overlapping mechanisms that produce mitochondrial decline in aging adults in a way that the clinical evidence supports as genuinely, measurably effective. You are not simply tired because you are old. The tiredness has a mechanism, and the mechanism has multiple specific addressable inputs. The fatigue that has been explained away for years as an inevitable feature of aging is a biological event occurring in the mitochondria of your cells, driven by specific deficiencies, specific inflammatory loads, specific medication effects, and the specific absence of the mitochondrial biogenesis signal that movement provides. Understanding this does not make the fatigue disappear overnight, but it transforms it from a mystery with no solution into a problem with identifiable causes and targeted responses. That transformation is where everything changes. Tell me in the comments how long you have been dealing with this kind of fatigue and whether the explanation you have been given has ever felt adequate. Tell me whether any part of this framework connects to something in your own experience that suddenly makes sense. Your words in this comment section matter to the person who is going to read them next, who may be in the exact same place you are right now, looking for someone to finally name what they are feeling with enough precision to do something about it. And please share this video with someone in your life who has been persistently exhausted and persistently told that there is nothing to be done about it, because there is something to be done. And now, finally, you both know what it is. Tired is not your destiny. It is a signal, and signals have sources. Now go find yours.